getting to yell and shake my finger and get rid of the tomato for 15 minutes. And I know I'm supposed to shut up because I'm a single white male, 5'10", uncut. But I will not shut up because this is a bunch of CRAP crap.
Two perhaps violations of Dayside Cable there, but we'll keep going. Kate McKinnon on SNL highlighting a serious issue stemming from the Kavanaugh controversy. The Washington Post reporting, quote, the sexual assault allegations against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh have sparked a wave of unbridled anger and anxiety from many Republican men who say they're in danger of being swept up by false accusers who are biased against them. This outbreak of male resentment now seems likely to play a defining role in the midterm elections just 5 weeks away, contrasting with a burst of enthusiasm among women, propelling Democratic campaigns and inspired by the national Me Too reckoning over sexual assault and gender roles. The piece goes on, quote, the Republican Party has long identified with more traditional white males, such as former Presidents Reagan and George W. Bush, but strategists say it's now turning more toward combative male candidates in the mold of Trump, with allegations of misconduct interpreted by many within the party, not as liabilities, but as unfair political attacks. Joining the conversation, Associated Press White House reporter Jonathan Lemire. Say it isn't so. It's now a political asset to punch people? That's unbelievable.
Well, President Trump, as a candidate, and as we've seen him since taking office, certainly has the idea of grievance is fueling so much of this political movement, and he's tapping into it now. He's made it very clear that he sees the Me Too movement not as a moment for women who have experienced sexual assault, sexual harassment to come forward with their stories, but rather he sees it as a danger for men who are accused of these things. And of course, without saying so, he's obviously reflecting back upon himself. He have more than a dozen women, we need a reminder, accused him of that sort of misbehavior in his, while businessman and then candidate. And he's seeing that now, too. He is saying today, you heard him on the White House lawn, suggesting that he was very afraid, not for young men and how they would be impacted by this. And when he was asked what his message would be for young women, he just said, well, women are doing great. So I think that there is an element of there are some men who are fueled by this backlash to Me Too, who feel like they're being unfairly treated, who are going to go out there and try to push forward with a sort of angry populism that we're seeing from him.
Can I just ask a question? I'm sorry. So, do we have any example or evidence of where these white young males or white males generally are being unfairly treated in this Me Too era? I mean, how many cases, allegations have come forward that have been shown that these men have been falsely accused? For every one, there are 100 or 1,000 women who actually have credible
sexual assault allegations. There are no more false sex crimes allegations than there are allegations of any other crime, and that's about 2 to 8%. 60, 70, perhaps a higher percentage of women who are assaulted in some fashion do not report it. So we're talking about a tiny number of people who may be falsely accused versus a whole bunch of people who are getting away with it. But this is the whole Republican Party. They have become professional victims. The people who are least entitled to claim it are now claiming victimhood. We are now supposed to cry tears for Donald Trump and Brett Kavanaugh, rich, entitled, privileged white guys, because they're not getting something they want. They are having a public temper tantrum. No one here has shown that either Dr. Ford or Deborah Ramirez have falsified anything, have been part of this conspiracy. They come across as credible, conscientious people. So when it comes to who's being wronged here, I don't think it's these two guys.
Ashley, this is the piece that I quoted was from your colleagues Phil Rucker and Robert Costa, and it certainly takes the conversation out of the serious and into almost the ludicrous, sort of he too is a political midterm message. Is that real?
Well, I think it is real because, A, they wrote that story. They wouldn't have written it if it wasn't real. But then the president today.
I'm not questioning the reporting. I'm just saying, are there campaigns that are looking at this as like a
thing? Striking is you then had the president today coming out and basically articulating the thesis of that article. And again, to the point over there is that this isn't necessarily based in reality. What it is based in is messaging and sort of visceral gut instinct. And if you take a number of the things the president said when he goes goes to communities and he churns up fears about immigrants taking away jobs, oftentimes the people who are most concerned about that are the communities that have the fewest immigrants, the fewest chances of that happening. And so this is a message that resonates. I have to be honest, I don't know how much we'll see this in ads necessarily, but it is something that plays well to the president's base, that politics of grievance and someone else is taking something away from you.
And it's not always broken down on gender lines. I mean, there's been plenty of anecdotal evidence of Republican women out in Trump rallies saying, you know, what Brett Kavanaugh's accused of doing, you know, that happens all the time. And, you know, if it happened to my daughters, I wouldn't really, you know, think twice about it. It's just like, whoa, you know, and their daughters are right there. And then,
But I guess the vast majority of men and women think that if a line is crossed and sexual assault, I think most human beings, men and women, think that sexual assault is bad, full stop. So I guess I can't figure out who the victims are.
So
no, I think
the president does.
Listen, I think
to be honest, his rhetoric doesn't say otherwise. I mean, he's
Roy Moore.
Right, he's perpetuating this mythology of machismo. You know, this is how guys talk. This is how we do. Hey, what's up? You know, it's that's kind of relationship with women. Now that women are pushing back and going, that's not the kind of relationship that we will any longer tolerate.
So there is an antiquated element to it. Obviously, he has this really madman mindset. There's a racial element, of course, because he doesn't really think presumption of innocence applies to all black people. I mean, he still is called Central Park 5 to be executed. And also there's the political element of this. And you hear constantly people saying, you know, we can't drop Kavanaugh because the next Supreme Court justice will just be accused of the same exact thing. And there's no evidence for this, right? No, Neil Gorsuch wasn't accused of any of this stuff. And obviously, if you don't want to be accused of sexual assault, the easiest thing to do is to not commit sexual assault. And so, you know, so none of this seems totally reality-based, but I don't think it can be dismissed as a semi-potent political feeling that the Republican Party is going through.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.